Wanted to develop a theme today, which is essentially that the international order that we're here to discuss is under pressure, that its resilience is being tested in a way that I can't remember in the 20 or 30, in fact, years that I've been teaching the subject of international relations. And I wanted to draw a comparison with the 1930s. And if I had my PowerPoint presentation here, I would have shown 5 aspects of the 1930s crisis, which ended in the Second World War, which I fear are uncannily familiar with the 5 factors that I identified as being the chief challenges to the continuation of this international order. Just to remind you why the 1930s ended in a world war. First, we had the Great Depression. Then we had a clash of ideologies between liberalism, fascism, and communism. Then we had a strategic vacuum in the world created by the US isolationism. Then we had a revisionist great power, 2 revisionist great powers, Germany and Japan, challenging the international order. And then we had a very weakened League of Nations. Now, today, we have a Great Recession, which we're coming out of, but the international economy is incredibly fragile. We have a potential clash of values, which has been defined by some as a clash of civilizations. We have a strategic vacuum created by the fact that the United States is no longer the power that it used to be. We have a revisionist great power, Russia, and we have a weakened United Nations. And let me say something about each of these very, very briefly. Emerging from the Great Recession, yes, we didn't get a depression in 2008. We escaped it, just. We went into a recession instead, from which we're just beginning to emerge. But we're not emerging very fast from it. In fact, globalization is slowing down. Those famous Bretton Woods institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, have now lost their monopoly position. Under Chinese leadership, a parallel set of institutions is beginning to emerge, but we have no idea whether these 2 institutions will be in conflict with each other or whether they'll be cooperating with each other. And the future course of history will be determined, of course, by China and whether it tackles its economic transition from investment and export-led growth to greater dependence on domestic demand. The stock market crisis is unfortunately a timely reminder that this transition is going to prove very difficult. Meanwhile, we have a World Trade Organization that hasn't negotiated a single extra major trade round since 1994. We have an International Monetary Fund whose governance structure is out of date. And we have a G20 that emerged in 2008 as an interesting institution, which has achieved almost nothing since then. And why is the international economy fragile? It's fragile for 3 reasons. We have a debt bubble of $232 trillion. After the United States came out of the Second World War, its debt was only 30% of GDP. Today it's 140% of GDP. We're printing money as we have never done in history before. It's called quantitative easing. Japan is printing $100 billion every month. And combined with this, we have a savings crisis because interest rates have never been as low as they are today. So we have not escaped the economic consequences of our practices in the 1990s and after. That's the first point. This is not going to be a very optimistic presentation, I'm afraid. The second is a clash of civilizations. Well, no, I don't think we have a clash of civilizations, but we have a new language of international politics, which is very disturbing, particularly for those who believe, as to some extent I do, what President Karzai had to say about the need to reintroduce morality into the international system. Let me just give you one example of this. It comes from Russia, where you will find Russian politicians, led principally by Vladimir Putin, but also others, now saying that Russia is engaged in a cultural battle with the Western world. The Western world doesn't respect religion and doesn't respect any values but its own, whereas Russia represents, through the Orthodox faith, something that is important. faith itself. There's a big cultural battle, which probably isn't so important in this part of the world, but it certainly is in my part of the world, about things such as gay marriage, for example. The President Putin likes to refer to Europe as gaytopia, the place where gays are safe, because they're certainly not safe in Russia. Sometimes this reaches ridiculous proportions. I remember the Eurovision Song Contest of 2013, when the Russian singer Dina Gavrapova didn't win the competition. And Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, rang up his opposite number, the Azerbaijani foreign minister, the next day, and said that because the Azerbaijani jury had not voted for Dina Gavrapova, there would be severe consequences. He never spelt out what those severe consequences actually were. But Putin has made it perfectly plain that Russia doesn't do global governance, it doesn't do global civil society, it doesn't do global human rights. It doesn't even do globalization. Sergei Lavrov said last year that Russia is a minority stakeholder in globalization. That's your project. It's not our project. So I'm afraid when it comes to counting Russia in as part of this new moral consensus in the world that President Karzai talked about, we have quite a challenge on our hands. And just one other little vignette about culture, which is very important. Cultural vandalism, on a scale that I think none of us in this room could have imagined 5 years ago. The cultural vandalism of ISIS destroying any culture that is not Islamic. And that includes 7 of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Syria, which have been damaged in the recent fighting. And what is happening in the city of Palmyra today is one of the great scandals of our times. And then I want to go on to the strategic vacuum. We don't have an isolated United States, but we have a United States that has been grievously wounded since the 2008 crisis. The moral standing of the West generally is not what it was because of our economic profligacy. And the moral authority of the West is not what it was because of the mistakes that have been made by Western politicians in the war on terror since 2003. The United States is still the only country that can lead the international community, but it is not the power that it once was. It's still the globocop, but it's a globocop a little like Britain at the end of the 19th century, which is finding it very difficult to sustain that role credibly. And countries like sharks, smelling the blood in the water, are already circling around. The problem is that not a single other great power in the international system is willing to offer an alternative. The United States is failing on one particular front, which is the fight against ISIS. It's actually been failing in the war against terror for some time. It has spent, who knows, between $4 and $6 trillion, considerably more than it spent in the Second World War, by the way, in today's dollar terms, on fighting al-Qaeda. With what result? In May this year, the United Nations issued a report that reminded the world al-Qaeda is still in business. 25,000 foreign terrorist fighters are now fighting for al-Qaeda or its affiliated organizations, traveling through more than 100 different countries. Al-Qaeda has not gone away. But of course, we are clearly concerned more these days with the presence of ISIS. The problem is that between 2001 and 2008, the United States did too much. Since 2008, it's done too little. That's our problem. It's not just theirs. And then there's the fourth factor, Russia as a revisionist power, challenging the international order by annexing a territory, Crimea, which was not its, and effectively trying to partition Ukraine by supporting the separatists. One New York Times writer, a Bulgarian analyst of Russian affairs, wrote recently that President Putin's understanding of being a great power is breaking the international rules without being punished. It's a peculiar definition, he said, of being a great power, because with power usually comes responsibility at keeping the international rules and policing the international system against the outlaws that challenge it. Russia is being deliberately obstructive and disruptive at the same time. And it has introduced into the world a new concept of warfare called hybrid warfare, which enables you essentially to occupy, invade, and attack other countries while claiming that you're not actually at war. It's not much fun living in a city like Tallinn or Riga or Vilnius at the moment. It's not much fun being in the Baltic states. And to just give you a little insight into this, I'll just mention three things. Lithuania has put out a manual for all its citizens outlining what to do if Lithuania is occupied by Russia. Estonia is going to build a wall, which is not going to be much help, along its border with Russia. Finland has alerted 900,000 of its citizens to the fact they may be called up at any time against Russia. Norway is producing a television program, a series, the most expensive in its history, about a Russian occupation of Norway. Now, this is the extent to which Russian revisionism has really hit my part of the world. It's hardly penetrated this part of the world. But my message for you is that there is another country in the region that might be tempted one day to be a revisionist power if it felt that its legitimate demands or its legitimate interests or ambitions are not going to be met. I do, of course, mention China. China so far is not a revisionist power and has shown no interest in challenging the international system. Far from it. It wishes to be have a greater voice in the management of that system. But where one country can lead, and Russia's not a great power, it's just a regional European power, other greater powers might one day follow, not just China, by the way. That's why the Russian factor is important for you in this region. My last point, which I won't dwell upon, is the United Nations, which has had an extraordinarily disappointing record in the last 20 years. If you take a country like the Congo, where 6 million people have died, where rape has been on such a scale that the United Nations itself was forced to set up a special commissioner for sexual violence for the first time in 2010. If you look at South Sudan, where UN forces are protecting 125,000 people who are at risk from what is going on. If you look at Syria, which is a situation that has been allowed to get completely out of control, with 250,000 dead in the last few years, you will find a failure of the only real institution we still have in the international system to keep the system going. And one of the reasons we have a migrant problem that we do, particularly in my part of the world, is people fleeing from political violence, which we're not managing at all. At best, we're freezing conflicts, no more than that. Now, the 1930s is the 1930s, and I'm not suggesting that this particular crisis is going to end in a world war, but I am suggesting that the international order is under challenge as it hasn't been for a very long time. But I wanted to end my presentation today by introducing just two factors that were not present in the 1930s, which I think we should look at very seriously. The first is social inequality, identified perhaps surprisingly by the bankers and the investment managers at the Davos meeting this January as the greatest challenge to the international order. And by that I mean the fact that we will soon have a population in the world, 75% of it living in cities or urban conurbations that are not the kind of cities that the rest of us in this room live in. Many of them will be just mega slums, not made out of steel, not made out of glass, made out of recycled plastic, cement blocks, scrap wood, anything that you can put together. They're effectively, as one sociologist calls them, waste disposal units. Waste disposal units for a vast mass of unemployed and unemployable people. This is a crisis, a dumping ground, if you like, for the collateral damage of our international economy. And that is where crime will breed, and the nexus between crime and terrorism and crime and political violence is, for me, one of the sustaining factors that have emerged recently that change the way we look at international security. And the other, the note on which I will conclude, is climate change. It's interesting that an Iraqi government was sacked, all three vice presidents and the deputy prime minister by the new government in Baghdad. Why was it sacked? Not because of security, because it couldn't provide the air conditioning that a population needs when temperatures rise as they have to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. An Iranian president, newly elected last year, whose very first decision in office is not about the nuclear program, but what to do with the largest lake in the country, one of the great salt water lakes in the world, that is disappearing. 80% of it has gone in the last 10 years. Or take Syria, where we have a revolution because we had a drought, which people forget. A drought which led 1 million people to leave the land and flood into the cities, where they were provided with no support at all from the Assad government. That, it seems to me, was one of the causes of the political conflict we see. So what's the message? The message is actually one that President Karzai touched upon this morning, which is that security can no longer be national. And whether you're dealing with climate change or whether you're dealing with ISIS, you have to have an international response. If you don't get that international response, as we didn't in the 1930s, you're going to get something deeply undesirable. Not a world war, something we may not be able to imagine. But nobody wants to live at a time when an international system collapses. And on that very pessimistic note, I will end. Thank you.